Welcome in. Welcome in, ladies and gentlemen, to another edition of All Access AM. I am Billy Embody. Happy Wednesday to all of you out there. We are on the eve of the college football playoff semifinals, continuing on with Miami facing Ole Miss and Oregon, Indiana on Friday night. So lots to talk about on that. We'll preview Miami, Ole Miss out there in the desert on this edition of All Access AM. We appreciate you guys being with us on this Wednesday morning. We're here Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, 7 to 8 a.m. Central, 8 to 9 a.m. Eastern time. Please hit the subscribe button to our YouTube channel, All Access AM, and help us keep this train rolling like Miami is hoping to do in the Fiesta Bowl. We'll also on this episode talk with Chad Bishop of the AJC to break down Georgia Tech getting their new offensive coordinator into the fold, and Blake Gideon leaving the program after just one season as defensive coordinator. We talked about some of that in the coaching carousel on Monday as well. So a lot of reaction from Chad. He's one of our regulars now out there from Atlanta, getting to Georgia Tech. And of course, we'll talk some ACC hoops as well as a big Tuesday night matchup goes the way of the Blue Devils in Louisville, looking for a signature win still under Pat Kelsey in a sense. So lots to talk about on this Wednesday. We appreciate Pony Up 214 for being here. Thanks a lot, buddy. And good seeing you on Monday as well in the SMU recruiting show that I do over at ontheponyexpress.com. So lots to talk about today as we decided to save the transfer portal bonanza for Thursday so that you had the Miami Ole Miss preview, you had the Oregon Indiana thoughts that I have ahead of the semifinal game beginning between for all of these teams, these last four that are in the mix. I'll make predictions as well as on those games as far as who's going to play for the national championship in Miami. Will it be Miami making it back home for that matchup, or will they be watching someone else take the field that evening? We will see very soon. So thanks for being here, guys. It has been a blast to get this thing off the ground with you guys here on All Access AM. And we appreciate one of our key sponsors for that, sponsoring our Wednesday show, and that is OPW Solutions. OPW Solutions, a terrific company for those of you in North Texas, in Oklahoma, in Arkansas, even looking to make sure you have that attention to detail on your company's commercial services needs. They can handle all of that for you, whether it be commercial landscaping, pressure washing, snow and ice control, fence and concrete repair, and more. Give AJ Crow a call, 214-444-2305. Make sure you reach out to them at opwsolutions.com. Again, that's 214-444-2305. And make sure as the winter kind of picks up around the country, and in particular where they could service you, you want to have all of that lined up ahead of time so you're not having to scramble when you need it later on. So OPW Solutions doing incredible work, and they can make sure that you are taken care of in that regard as well. All right, let's jump into Miami Ole Miss. Miami and Ole Miss here, two unlikely of sorts teams that are in the college football playoff semifinals. I think a lot of people early in the year would have had obviously Miami in this situation. A lot of updated brackets, maybe say after September, certainly had the Hurricanes in this type of a scenario. But they did have that slump, losing to Louisville, losing to SMU, but they figured it out. Mario Cristobal and that staff got that roster rolling in the right direction, and we see what has now played out. Ole Miss, meanwhile, dealt with and is dealing with one of the most incredible stories you've ever really watched unfold in the college football landscape, especially in terms of coaching carousel moves. I put the whole Lane Kiffin, Ole Miss, LSU, and even Florida kind of out there saga right up there with, man, I remember when Cam Newton dealt with the eligibility issues. Obviously, you look back on like a Bobby Petrino in Arkansas. There's all sorts of different moments in time around college football that I feel like you know where you were when things happened, and watch the saga play out. And feel free to chime in the comments. I'm sure there's more outstanding ones, but those are some of the ones that come to mind for me. And meanwhile, this Ole Miss team just kept on winning. They put their heads down and they wanted to prove the country wrong. They wanted to prove Lane Kiffin wrong as far as why he should leave Ole Miss and leave Oxford and not pursue a national championship there when maybe he does have a national championship team that he has built for these Ole Miss Rebels that are looking to advance to that national championship game with a win over Miami. Miami, meanwhile, has been a program that has shown when you stay patient in today's day and age of college football, when you stay on track with somebody who clearly gets it and cares. And we talked about this on Monday with Georgia Tech bringing in somebody who bleeds for Georgia Tech and their new offensive coordinator, Mario Cristobal. It doesn't get more Miami than that in a sense. I mean, you could hire Michael Irvin, you could hire Ray Lewis, but as far as somebody with a plan who can get it done and bleed for the U, it's Mario Cristobal. And he has done a tremendous job recruiting, a tremendous job adjusting and tweaking all of the things that you need to in today's day and age of college football to figure things out. And even did so, whatever it was, during the course of this season to get this team back on track because past Miami teams had cratered, past Miami teams had dealt themselves that knockout blow like last year's team losing to Syracuse and missing out on an ACC championship game. Now Miami playing for a spot in the national championship because Mario Cristobal was able to finally press those right buttons for the Hurricanes in the course of the regular season. And once they got to the playoffs, they were able to play up to their competition level and stand out and continue to show why that roster that we saw in September that grabbed those wins, that was able to knock off a Notre Dame and beat a Florida and beat a pesky USF team, they were able to play this style of football and play this level of football that allows them to get to this point. And with Miami, they come into this game as a team that looks like on paper can slow Ole Miss down. They really hold up well as far as the matchups go. When you look at these two teams and what they bring to the table, Miami allowing 4.4 yards per play, Ole Miss 5.3. That'll be a tough defensive challenge for Ole Miss with Trinidad Chambliss at quarterback to overcome. Opponents, have come into Miami's world as far as defense goes and found out that they have the trenches. And it's not just a Reuben Bain. It's an Akeem Mesidor. It's Moton. It's Justin Scott. It's all of these guys that have been recruited and developed and brought in to make these difference-making plays. And that's before you get to the back end, and we saw what Keontae Scott can bring from a game-changing playmaking perspective. And that's what these teams in the college football playoff have found out about Ole Miss. They found out, when a Texas A&M or an Ohio State is going up against Miami for some of these recruits that are playing on the other side of them now and transfers, they found out, wow, look at what they put together and look at what it looks like now. And then you've got Corey Heatherman pulling the strings behind the curtain, being able to make things work defensively. And that's going to be a huge challenge for Charlie Weiss Jr., the play caller for Ole Miss, and a team that, I'm very familiar with just watching them up close this season. Trinidad Chambliss came in for Austin Simmons once he got injured earlier this year and just lit it up. And I was not necessarily high on that happening. That's a huge jump from D2 Ferris State, where he had won a national championship, to then jumping up to the SEC and playing in front of more fans in one single game than he had his entire career at Ferris State, you could argue. That is such a big jump, but Trinidad has such a great maturity about him and a great way about him. When you watch him do interviews or you watch him on the field having fun, that's who he is. He's almost the anti-Carson Beck. Carson Beck out there, and you see him get demonstrative at times when things go wrong, or you see him look kind of, ticked off, kind of not even almost happy at times when things are going on in the game. I watched this post-game interview after Ohio State, and you're like, okay, you just advanced to the semifinals of the college football playoff. Get a little happier there, but it's just two different guys and two different ways that they go about things. And this is all fun and new for Trinidad Chambliss in a sense at this level. Carson Beck has been here before. He has been to this level and closing in on this mountaintop. And that is the difference between these two. And I don't know if it's going to be an X factor. I think Trinidad Chambliss has shown he can be nails when Ole Miss has certainly needed it. They were able to waltz by Tulane earlier in this playoff, but then they get to Georgia and they get their chance to knock off the Bulldogs. And boy, they almost let it slip away again, but he was able to come up with the game-changing plays to get that done. So when I look at this matchup between Miami and Ole Miss, we talked about some of the quarterback play there, especially Trinidad and what he's going to bring. He's going to bring an ability to escape. He's going to bring an ability to extend plays. How does Miami defend that? Because Marcel Reed could have moved around a little bit. Julian saying not really as much. But this Trinidad, ability that he has to make special game-changing plays, I don't know what that's going to look like in the um in the course of this game. I really don't know because you have Akeem Mesidor, you have Ruben Bain, you have a Keontae Scott even who can kind of be in the box and kind of watching. You have Wesley Bissaint and you have that talented group of linebackers for Miami as well that can make plays and has been physical and has been able to impose their will. How does that impact how they rush the passer? How does that impact how they get after a Trinidad Chambliss? Because if you have a quarterback who can extend plays, you have somebody that puts that extra level of stress on your defense. What does Corey Heatherman do to attack that and not necessarily sit back and let it happen to you? Because I do think with the amount of talent Miami does have in their secondary, they need to find a way to force Trinidad Chambliss's hand into throwing some interceptions. And he's not allergic to making poor decisions at times. At times, he's been very, very good. But there have been teams that have been able to do that and make things difficult on him at times. I think when you look back on the season, I'd be interested to see how much Miami will watch that LSU game, which was a really terrific football game. But an LSU team that couldn't get anything going offensively was still able to play some really quality defense against Ole Miss. Ole Miss ultimately pulls away. They win that game. But there were moments in that game where you were watching Trinidad Chambliss and you were like, oof, okay, little flustered. It was kind of his first big game as a starter at Ole Miss, and now he's seasoned. Now he's got that experience under his belt in the college football playoff. But what LSU was able to do against Ole Miss, is that how Miami kind of attacks it? Because that LSU defense was really good this year for the most part. So something to keep an eye on there. How does Miami contain Trinidad Chambliss as far as what he does as far as extending plays? How much does that change how Ruben Bain and Akeem Mesidor and all of those guys pursue him and get after him, play in, play out? That's one piece when you're looking at Miami matching up to this Ole Miss offense. The main piece, though, how does Miami contain Ole Miss running back Kewan Lacey, one of the best running backs in the country? I think what he's done behind an offensive line that entered the season being a group that was very questionable. It was the group that Ole Miss fans were sitting back and saying, okay, they're banged up in fall camp. When are we going to get a look at the fully healthy group? And man, they were able to do a really good job throughout this season, thanks in part to Trinidad Chambliss and his ability, as well as Kewan Lacey and his ability to pick up yards after contact. And Kewan Lacey ends up being a Doak Walker finalist. I mean, my pick for the number one running back in the country. I think you've got to look at what he did for most every game this year and respect what he did. And he was just incredible at producing yards after contact. He's a really special back who just agreed to returning to Ole Miss for next season. When you see him and you watch him run, Miami's motor, Miami's ability to gang tackle, that is going to be critical. And this is very obvious. I think Miami, if they can shut down Kewan Lacey, can win this game and maybe win it by double digits. That's just when you look at being able to stop a Trinidad Chambliss, if he's one dimensional and if that offense is one dimensional, that is going to be very interesting to watch because Keywan Lacey and his ability to produce on the ground has led this Ole Miss offense to be very balanced and to allow their group of playmakers to have extra space because you have to commit an extra man to stopping the run. Miami is, when you look at this Ole Miss schedule, whew, probably not, probably above Oklahoma, probably above LSU, probably the best defensive line that Ole Miss has faced all season long. How do they handle that matchup with that Miami defensive line? Because we've seen Ohio State get slowed down. We've seen Texas A&M get stopped completely. How does this matchup go? Because there is something special to this Ole Miss team. There is something special to what they've been able to do to keep their head down, to keep working despite Lane Kiffin leaving, despite them pulling at assistants, despite these assistants flying back and forth between Baton Rouge and Oxford, despite tampering being involved, all of the things that are being talked about daily around this Ole Miss roster and their former head coach. I mean, it's unbelievable. But Pete Golding, their defensive coordinator, now head coach, has done a tremendous job of being himself. And the team has taken that on. He wants to put a lot of the emphasis on the players, and he wants to give all the credit to the players and how they've handled it. And you could argue that the model, and you know this piece, the model that Ole Miss has built pursuing so many players from the transfer portal, knowing full well it's very professional. It's a very professionally run organization as far as their expectations. They talk about free agency, they talk about cutting, they talk about releasing and signing and acquiring and all of the terms that we're so used to in the NFL. So these professionals have put their head down and produced because that's what there's an expectation of them to do that. And so when Pete Golding got to the helm and took over this situation, he made it very clear. We're going to play football. We're going to spot the ball. That's their motto. That's what they go after. They made some minor tweaks, but he expects Charlie Weiss Jr. to be all in. He expects any assistant to be there, to be all in. And they've shown that now. They've shown that through 2 college football playoff games that this is how it's going to be. We're going to step up and we're going to play a certain way because that's the expectation that we've built. And he's very, when Pete Golding and Lane Kiffin could not be any more different, as far as who they are, how they talk, how they dress, how they this, how they that. But the mentality that Ole Miss's defense has had these last few seasons under Pete Golding, you've seen it take over this entire football team more and more each year that he's been there. And it's now paying off with this college football playoff run. That said, when you look at the Ole Miss defense, allowing 5.3 yards per play from opponents, this is not the Ole Miss defense of last year. This is a little bit more bend but not break. That is a challenge for Ole Miss. Their red zone scoring defense allowed is not something that you really sit there and you want to tout. Almost 90% red zone scoring efficiency for opposing offenses against this Ole Miss defense. So that is another piece for that Miami offense now when you look at that group and how they have been playing well enough for them to win these 2 major college football playoff games, playing well enough where they're not hurting you and doing things that can take away from what your defense is doing and giving extra possessions and all of those things. And at the same time, Miami's offense sitting there at scoring in the red zone at a 90% clip. Ole Miss's offense, 85%, so still pretty good there. But when you look at that allowed red zone defense scoring, Ole Miss giving up 89% in the red zone, Miami 79% in the red zone. That is a very interesting stat to watch for me going into this game. Who comes away with field goals? Who comes away with touchdowns? Big difference there because you do have to capitalize on these drives when you're facing a Miami defense if you're Ole Miss, first and foremost. Ole Miss's offense, they have to put touchdowns on the board when they have opportunities, because how many opportunities are you going to have? That is a huge question for me. They are one of the better scoring defenses in college football, and when it comes to the red zone and keeping teams out of that, and Ole Miss has just not necessarily been as good in that regard, and it's a pretty stark difference, and it's a concerning difference. They're among the bottom 15 or so teams in the country at red zone scoring defense. That is where you have a Miami offense that has been able to show that the trenches can push them over the top. The offensive line that Miami has, I think, faces a more difficult matchup than Miami's defensive line faces. Miami's offensive line faces a group led by Randall Joyner on the defensive line that has some dudes on it. William Eccles and Zay Harris and Suntarian Perkins, who can rush the passer and really kind of ruin Carson Beck's day if that group up front, led by Francis Maui-Noah, doesn't protect him at a high level. That is a question that I have, because you do have a Miami offensive line that has run the ball well in the college football playoff. They've closed things out, so they've worn on them. Shannon Dawson is going to have to continue to focus on the run and keep on the run game like he has all playoff long. And eventually it could wear down this Ole Miss defense. That is going to be something that they are going to try to do. And at the same time, this is the moment, I think, that Carson Beck has to make a couple explosive throws that really change the game, that really take it to another level for Miami. And if that happens, you're going to be looking at a team that is explosive offensively, looks the part of a national championship type of team, and could very well end up not only playing for a national championship, but winning it. That is probably the thing that I'm watching closest. Can Carson Beck, step up a level in terms of what he has done so far this playoff without compromising and turning the football away because he's being more aggressive? Big question I have there. I'll be fascinated to see how this Ole Miss secondary plays. They've got a bunch of different pieces there. That is something that I think, and it's kind of been a little interesting to watch unfold. But Ole Miss, the way they built this team, they built them without a star in a sense. They brought and now there are stars. Now there's Trinidad Chambliss. Now there's Kewan Lacey. Kewan Lacey was a very limited use running back out of Missouri last year in the transfer portal. But they brought him in and they bet on him big, and it won in a big way. They could tell early on. They brought in multiple receivers. They didn't bring in a Trey Harris. They didn't bring in some of these, high price tag guys. They didn't bring in a Walter Nolan. They littered their linebacking core with transfers. They littered their secondary with transfers. No one was really this day one transfer portal freak who's going to be a top 3 round NFL draft pick that they had to pay millions of dollars for. They didn't do that this year. They built it on depth. But when you have guys who have true stardom ahead, like a Malachi Toney, like a CJ Daniels, how does that play out against that Ole Miss secondary? That's something where they've faced a lot of talented receivers. They've been able to generally play a good level of defense against a lot of these explosive receivers. As far as the passing game for opposing offenses, they've been able to be a top 30 pass defense as far as yards per play. And they're one of the best passing offenses in the country, top 10. So that is a really interesting piece to this puzzle, because Miami has a couple of explosive players that can really put stress on you and maybe make you defend that whole width of the field. What does that mean for Mark Fletcher in the run game? I would bet on Miami's offensive line maybe taking just a slight step back this game as far as what they're able to do as far as running the football. But make no mistake, they're going to stick with it. And I do think with the Miami defensive line, I think they can slow down Kewan Lacey just enough here to make Trinidad Chambliss have to throw the ball a bunch. And for Ole Miss, you look at what they've done as far as passes per game, they're kind of middle of the road. They're much more of a lean on the ground game, almost 40 rushes a game. When you look at this passing attack, they don't necessarily want Trinidad Chambliss to throw it 45, 50 times a game like some of these offenses do. And if Miami's defensive line forces that to happen, it's a good situation for Miami to be in. The offense must capitalize against a defense that has been able to be much better in the secondary than people anticipated in Oxford going into this season. There were some injuries early on. There were some different players that there was some unknowns with, and they've all stepped up in a big way to be a top 25 passing defense. The run defense for Ole Miss, despite having some of those big uglies up front, has been kind of the issue at times. But I think there's a lot of talent in there. There's a lot of talent for that Ole Miss run defense, and it is a really intriguing piece because sometimes the paper doesn't always match up with the stats. And I think this is a game that we're going to find out if that's true or if Ole Miss season's going to end because of it. Because Miami is going to stay committed to running the ball. Ole Miss's defense ranks 77th in run defense as far as yards per rush. That is a focal point for Miami to stick with it. If Mark Fletcher breaks some of those and gets it rolling early on, they involved a couple of different guys in the Ohio State game as well. Pringle's in there and Pringle's involved. How do they make a game-changing play in the run game and get a couple big gains that forces them to bring another guy down in the box? Maybe you get Malachi Toney in space, then maybe you get CJ Daniels one-on-one. That's how you start to get things rolling if you're Miami. So Shannon Dawson and company, it's going to be a great chess match between Shannon Dawson and Pete Golding, who still calls the plays for that Ole Miss defense. This is a Ole Miss team that has shown a little bit of maybe, a team of destiny type, but maybe this Miami team is that. Maybe they're just not there yet with some of the feel-good stories around college football like this Ole Miss team has, kind of giving the finger to Lane Kiffin in a sense with these two playoff wins that they have under their belt now. Predictions go. This is a game that if you've been watching this entire breakdown, I think you kind of know I'm going to pick Miami to win this game. The over under set at 51.5 points. Miami currently favored by 3. I was listening to Kelly Gramlich and Eric McClain earlier this week break this one down, and they said, man, Miami being favored, that doesn't make me feel good. Yeah, I would agree. If you're picking this game, Miami being favored doesn't make you feel good. Ole Miss has gone out and kind of shown people what they can do by beating Georgia now. I'm surprised this isn't a closer spread, but also Miami doing what they did to Ohio State and doing it in dominant fashion. This feels like a game to me going in where if you've watched a 7-game series play out in the NBA, the NHL, wherever you watch it, this is a team that is up 2-1 in the series right now. They're looking to, get a key win in the series to then put everything in a decisive, 5-game series win, right? That's what it feels like for Miami going into this game. They're up 2-1 in the series. They got to go kind of on the road to face a team that is desperate, looking to tie it at 2-2, looking to make it a best of 3 for that game 7 ultimately. And Miami is going to get that 3-1 series advantage of sorts and head back to Miami, head home, close it out. Now, that it was me giving away maybe national championship pick. But in terms of this game in particular, you have Miami with that 2-1 series lead, it feels like to me. They've dealt with the two toughest tasks, and I'm not trying to take away from Ole Miss in this because Trinidad Chambliss has an incredible ability, and he could very well will this team to a win in this game. But I think what Miami has shown in the playoffs, beating Texas A&M on the road, beating Ohio State the way they did, they have, if you're looking at a pure resume of playoff teams, they have that resume that gives me a little bit more confidence to pick this game. I think Miami wins by double digits, and I hate to say that because I think Ole Miss is a really good story. I've got a lot of friends that are on that staff. I just think what we've seen from Miami now is starting to turn into that special team. Miami starting to feel maybe like Ohio State last year, where when they got into the playoffs, you were like, oh, wow, they made it in. What are they going to do? They have the talent, and they've stepped up to the plate, and they've shown why they've deserved to be in. They're up 2-1 in the series. Can they get that 3-1 series lead? And then you see whatever happens in the national championship. I'm using that as a comparison to how this feels. This feels like a team that knows it's better. This team feels like one that can go into the Fiesta Bowl and go grab a win because they have the better roster. They have the better appetite to get home to Miami to then play for a national championship with the trophy in the building, the cup in the building, the whatever the MLB gives out, the whatever the NBA gives out, trophy in the building. That's what Miami's playing for. They're playing for that moment of getting back home and having that entire city be set on fire in a good way for that lead up to that national championship game. That can't be understated. Get home to Miami. Don't be sitting at home watching somebody else play for the national championship in your building. In your building. And that's what I think Miami's playing for. That's why I've got Miami by double digits in this one. It's a bold pick. It's a bold pick, but I'm ready to ride with it. And on the flip side, I don't have too much to say with Oregon, Indiana, but it is a really good matchup. I think this is going to be the better game between these two. I think they have the rematch, obviously, and what Oregon experienced against Indiana earlier this season. Oh, boy. Going on the road for the Hoosiers to beat Oregon the way they did, 30-20, in a game that didn't feel as close as the final score was earlier this year. Man, you have to be thinking, if you're Kurt Signetti, I don't know if he thinks this way actually, but you have to be thinking if you're an Indiana fan, you're like, this is the perfect way. We faced Oregon. We've beaten Oregon on the road. Now we get to face them in the Peach Bowl. We're sitting pretty here. We don't have to battle any elements in this one. We're all flying across the country. That's an even split. Fernando Mendoza playing very well, just crushed Alabama. Oregon, though, is getting healthy. Oregon is coming off of a really impressive win over Texas Tech, the way that they dominated that game. And if not for Dan Lanning being as aggressive as he is, if maybe they take some more points here and there, that game and that final tally between those two teams looks a lot worse. But Dan Lanning is probably not going to change who he is in that regard. So will that keep Indiana in this game? Will that allow Indiana extra opportunities to win this football game in the Peach Bowl? That is something that I'm worried about. The line is 3.5 in this one, favoring, of course, Indiana, as we get ready for this one with a total set at 47.5. I like the lower number in this game. I could see this one being kind of a 20-17 classic. I think when you see these two teams, you see teams that are as really kind of healthy as they've been all season, especially Oregon now getting some key guys back. And you saw that. You saw, I think, when you get this game into a dome, maybe Oregon eliminates some of the snap issues that they had. There were a couple off center for Dante Moore. There's one that rolled all the way back that cost them points at the end of that half. You have a lot of things to keep in mind when you look at Oregon and just kind of how much better they are looking, at least to me, as they get healthier going into this one. Give me Oregon in this one. I like the Ducks to cover first and foremost, and I do think they get it done like 20-17. Dan Lanning is a stellar coach. Kurt Signetti is a stellar coach. This is just going to be a potential masterclass at managing a game. Whoever wins this one has managed it better. It hasn't been because of an alarming number of turnovers either way that tilts it one way or the other, in my opinion. I don't think you're going to see two teams that are very well prepared, that look the part physically. You see what both of these rosters look like now that they've built up these two programs, especially year two of Indiana. This has been a years and years build for Dan Lanning to this, very similar to a Mario Cristobal. And then we get delivered the Miami-Oregon matchup. Mario Cristobal taking on his former team, Oregon. Dan Lanning, another former Alabama assistant with Mario Cristobal, getting to take on each other head-to-head in a national championship for the King of Miami, whoever the King of Miami is. That'll be the national championship game, right? Dan Lanning and Oregon trying to claim Miami in Miami versus Miami trying to hold serve at home in Hard Rock. So that is my game picks for the semifinals: Miami over Ole Miss, Oregon over Indiana, and all setting up for a home game for Miami in Hard Rock. So really, really fun stuff. Looking forward to these games in a big way. They're Thursday, Friday night, and we've got a lot to enjoy about those. We do have Chad Bishop of the AJC joining us to talk some Georgia Tech football. Really excited for Chad to join us. But first, before we do, I want to remind you guys about our friends at the La La Land Foundation. If you haven't been to a La La Land Kind Cafe in 2026, make the move to go over there and experience what is kindness. That is what we try to talk about when we talk about the La La Land Foundation, and how you can visit this extension of the La La Land Kind Cafe and focus on starting your day with a cup of kindness. Yes, they have coffee. Yes, they have incredible treats and pastries and all those things that people like to have. But what they do best is helping their communities and helping the youth of America transition into adulthood from the foster care system. They operate several programs in ways that you can support them, whether it be monetarily, whether it be events, whether it be in-kind donations, mentorships. There's all sorts of different opportunities for you around the country to support the La La Land Foundation. So go to lalalandfoundation.com and start off 2026 by sharing a little bit of kindness in this world. It's a great, great foundation that we're proud to be partnered with, the La La Land Foundation. So without any further ado, we do add Chad Bishop into this conversation around the college football world. Good morning, Chad. How are you?
Doing great. How are you doing this morning? Got my coffee? Let's do it.
Let's do it. Let's start with this. How are you feeling about these semifinal games?
Man, really excited to see this Ole Miss journey continue. I think it's definitely turned into the story of college football with the Lane Kiffin situation, with Pete Golding taking over, the play of Trinidad Chambliss, which in that Georgia game, I mean, was like video game next level, right? So I'm excited to sort of see, how they do moving forward against this Miami defense, which we all know is just like bonkersly good. So that's number one. And then two, Indiana right here in Atlanta, playing their semifinal game. Like, can anybody stop them? Can they stop themselves? Can anybody slow them down? What a remarkable story that is. Because, we all remember last year how good Indiana was, and we all kind of shrugged our shoulders and said, well, good for them, probably a one-off. And lo and behold, they're still just beating people down left and right. It doesn't matter if you're, Ohio State or Bowling Green State. They're whipping people up. So really, really interesting to see how they do moving forward, if they can keep it rolling and just keeping the beatdown going.
Do you have a prediction as far as who's playing the national championship here very soon?
I can't bet against Indiana at this point. I mean, kind of like I said, like I think we're all kind of waiting for the bottom to fall out. Well, they'll lose to Oregon, or they'll lose to Ohio State, or they'll lose to a Penn State. Or they're not going to. I mean, they're just beating everybody. So I'm sort of off the doubter train, and I'm on the all-in train. I mean, until someone knocks them off, they have to be the favorite. I think with the way Miami is playing defense right now, and everybody knows defense wins championships, maybe I would put them at number 2. But man, I'm not going against Indiana at any point right now.
You are probably a wise man. I think I'm going to get exposed on that one. I did pick Oregon, but I picked Miami in this one. We'll see. I'm interested to see how it goes. But
that's why they play the games, man. That's why they play the games.
Exactly. Speaking of wait and see, the offensive coordinator search for Georgia Tech has been one that I don't want to say dragged out, because it didn't feel like it was such a long process, but it kind of ended up being, in a sense. they finally land on their hire. George Godsey is brought back to Atlanta to coach his alma mater. What have you heard about how this all came together for Brent Key?
Well, George Godsey did a radio interview on, Wednesday, on Tuesday, and he said this was brought to his, slid across his desk about a month ago. And that sort of checks out. When we talked to Brent Key, after Selection Sunday in the bowl games, he said he had about 30, 33, 36 guys he was looking at. So that would make sense that, he probably called up his old friend George Godsey and floated the idea. But George is in the middle of an NFL season with the Baltimore Ravens coaching the tight ends, and those guys are trying to make the playoffs. So it sort of makes sense from that standpoint of like, all right, George Godsey probably says, I'm definitely interested, but I'm coaching an NFL team. Let's continue to talk. And in the meantime, Brent talked to, we heard Corey Dennis from UNLV, Chip Kelly, was an option for this Georgia Tech program. There were some other names out there, Pat Craddock. There was the offense coordinator at Old Dominion, whose name was rumored to have interviewed. But I think in the end, for those who don't know, Brent Key and George Godsey are like stepbrothers from the movie Step Brothers. I mean, those guys are like best buds. They were teammates. They were coaches together at UCF. They've stayed super close over the years. Brent Key and George Godsey's family are very close. So it's curious because it's like, did Brent Key just go and hire his buddy, or does he really truly believe this is the best fit for Georgia Tech football moving forward? George Godsey has not been a college coach for like 15 years. He's never been a college offensive coordinator. Now, that doesn't mean he's not a great coach, but there's going to be some hurdles and challenges there. Can George Godsey recruit? Can he relate to the college football player in 2026 and 2027? Those are questions that are going to be big ones that need to be answered moving forward. I don't think the offense is going to change. It's going to be very similar to how it's always been. It's really Brent Key's offense, and he's just got people sort of running it for him, right? So, it's an interesting hire for sure. But folks are excited because George Godsey was a star quarterback at Georgia Tech, and he's back in white and gold.
I can't wait for Brent Key to drop that. He's going to get on the mic and say, "Talk to me, Goose." On he's got his work cut out for himself. Figuring out the quarterback situation right away. He's had tons of experience working with really solid quarterbacks and things like that. But that's something where nowadays I wonder the recruiting and personnel department for Georgia Tech, Brent Key, how far down the road are they in finding their quarterback already, and how much of it is, hey, we've got Chris Winkie here who can work with the quarterbacks, of course, but now we've got our offensive coordinator in place. We just need somebody who's going to, make a good impact on this offense schematically, because we're going to give you the players that you need to have success.
Yeah, no doubt. And Brent Key said this offseason, I thought it was really telling that he trusts Chris Winkie and his evaluation of quarterbacks more than anyone. And Chris Winkie's been around forever. We all know he won the Heisman Trophy as a quarterback himself. Has been coaching quarterbacks a super long time. I mean, he's the one that had the relationship with Haynes King that brought Haynes King to Atlanta. He recruited Graham Knowles, who's on the roster now, Grady Adamson, who's on the roster now. So it'll be a situation of, do they want to ride with who's on the roster now? Do they want to go out and spend some money and get, maybe a 1-year transfer rental, or a transfer who's maybe got 2 or 3 years of eligibility left? And they've been very honest about they will curtail their schematics and their system to the personnel, which was what smart coaches do. And that's what they did with Haynes King. They made that offense work to Haynes King's skill sets and his strength. And that won't change moving forward. I mean, the offense will still have a ton of motions and shifts and still be predicated on physical offensive line play and running the ball. It'll just only change a little bit depending on who that quarterback is. So with George Godsey being back there, who's coached a million quarterbacks, with Chris Winkie, who's done the same, and with Brent Key, who's worked with some awesome quarterbacks as well from his time at UCF and Alabama, they're going to find the right fit and sort of shape shift, right, is a good word for that offense moving forward, whoever the quarterback is. And I would expect them to probably go find one here in the transfer portal to provide depth and competition for this team in 2026.
When you look at the defensive side of the ball, we knew the struggles this year under Blake Gideon. Well, he exits stage left back to Texas. What opportunity does that open up for Georgia Tech to make maybe a not a first-time play calling hire? If that's Brent Key's offense on the other side there, this is a defense that has to have a head coach of the defense, I feel like.
Yeah, for sure. And it's wild to think that this Georgia Tech defense, since I've started, has pretty much had a new defensive coordinator every single season. It was
Yeah.
Andrew Thacker. He got demoted in the middle of the season, and Kevin Shearer took over. And then Tyler Santucci came in, and the defense had really improved under Tyler Santucci. He left for the Baltimore Ravens, so Blake Gideon comes in from Texas. And that's still kind of a murky situation. Blake Gideon, all reports are he's going back to Texas. But as of right now, he's still at Georgia Tech and still employed by the Yellow Jackets. So whether he stays or goes remains to be seen. If he goes, then you're looking for yet another defensive coordinator to change this entire defensive thing around yet again. I mean, there's plenty of names out there that have been rumored. Jeremy Pruitt's name has popped up. Eric Henderson from USC, his name has popped up. And then, of course, like I said, Blake Gideon's name is still there. He's still on Georgia Tech's campus coaching and recruiting for the Yellow Jackets. So it's certainly confusing and a weird time, I think, for this Georgia Tech defense. My argument is it's not going to matter if they don't get better players. I mean, they got to get some better guys in there. They had a solid defense this past season in terms of personnel, but they got to improve, especially on the defensive line, really at every level of that defense. So if they don't go heavy in the transfer portal and in recruiting in years to come on the defensive side, I don't think they're going to get to that championship level of football. So I think everybody sort of, looks at the defensive coordinator and the coaches, but in my mind, it's got to start with the players and upgrading that roster on the defensive side.
Yeah, how much of it, when you look at a defensive coordinator hire, would then go into somebody like Eric Henderson, defensive line coach by trade, very well respected in that regard, and a well-known recruiter since he's got back into the college ranks, versus somebody who has maybe more skins on the wall as a play caller? What do you think is going through Brent Key's mind in that regard?
Probably both, right? Probably a balance. I think that's what you look at with offense, right? Like you brought in George Godsey. No one's like, whoa, best recruiter, because he hasn't recruited in 15 years because he's been in the NFL. So you're not going to really probably rely on George Godsey to recruit. I think most good coaching staffs, right, are built with a combination of outstanding coaches and outstanding recruiters. I mean, shoot, Georgia Tech's got a kid now, Kobe Jones, who's coaching cornerbacks, but he's turned out to be one of their best recruiters, and nobody knows how good of a coach he is because he's only like 26, 27 years old, but he's killing it in the recruiting game. But you bring in some older guys, like a Jess Simpson on the defensive line and a Kyle Pope coaching defensive ends, sort of veteran coaches. You mix all those guys together and sort of try to find that right mixture. So with the defensive coordinator, do you want to go get some guy who, is the best recruiter in the country and maybe have all those guys work together to formulate a defensive game plan? Or do you want to get maybe an old head, so to speak, right? A guy who is a big-time play caller and a big-time defensive systems guy, but maybe recruiting is not necessarily his thing. It's a gray area. It's a slippery slope, but I think the good coaches figure out a way to mold that and mesh that staff together to make it all work.
Last one, and we'll get you out of here. What is your initial take on the transfer portal efforts that you've seen from Georgia Tech? Where are they placing the most emphasis so far in this offseason?
To me, it's been great, and I compare it to last year, which probably isn't fair, but it is what it is. And last season, Georgia Tech's strategy was sort of to get guys who had performed, played well at whatever level they were playing at, and hope that translated to Georgia Tech. And it really didn't work out, honestly. They got, not throwing kids under the bus, but Ronald Triplett came from UTSA, didn't do a whole lot. Braden Manley came from Mercer, didn't do a ton. Even Eric Rivers and Dean Patterson from FIU at wide receiver. I remember the Sporting News had Eric Rivers as a preseason All-American, and their seasons just didn't work out the way that Georgia Tech had hoped for. And sometimes that happens, right? That's the risk of the transfer portal. So you look at this season. They've already got Jalen Mbakwe, I hope I'm saying that right, from Alabama, yep. Former 5-star, who's a wide receiver and a defensive back. Have an offensive lineman already from Alabama, defensive lineman from Rutgers. It seems like they're really going a little bit more higher level in their efforts to get guys from not just FBS programs, but Power 4 programs. There's an All-American tight end from Dartmouth coming in. So really, really high-level players, right, and sort of shifting that strategy of maybe not just guys who have been productive, but been very productive at a very high level and have a lot more, talent, whatever that means. Their talent meter is probably higher than last year's transfer portal class. So I've been pretty impressed with what they brought in so far, and it's only been a handful of guys. I'm sure there'll be a ton more in the coming days as this week goes on, because they got a lot of spots to fill. A lot of guys graduated from this Georgia Tech team. So with the recruits they're bringing in, some of the high-level transfers they're bringing in, I think it's softened the blow a little bit from a tough offseason so far.
Chad Bishop, we appreciate all the time this morning. Enjoy watching the games, and yeah, have fun. We'll see you next time.
All right, buddy, later.
All right, there he goes, Chad Bishop, joining us on All Access AM. We appreciate his time as always, giving you guys the goods on the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets. We also want to encourage you guys, and we'll get to a great question in the chat. That one is pretty, I would say, easy for me to get to. But before we do that, from Cam Ward for Heisman, I want to remind you guys about our friend Doyle Glass, honoring the heroes of America through his books, Lions of Medina and Swift Sword, two of the best books with firsthand accounts of the Vietnam War that you'll find. He's one of the best-selling authors on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, and we appreciate his support of the show for many reasons, but most importantly, giving our listeners an incredible way to connect with these heroes, because he tells their stories in such a terrific way. Lions of Medina and Swift Sword. You can purchase them on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other retailers. You can have the book delivered in a matter of days or less, depending on where you live, from Amazon. So check it out. And I encourage you to really check out Swift Sword, an incredible firsthand account of September 4th, 1967. We appreciate Doyle for his support of All Access AM. Make sure you check out his books today. He's also got a World War II one coming this year. Cam Ward for Heisman. Sorry for taking a minute to get this question up there on the screen, but we really appreciate you jumping in the chat, and I appreciate the compliment about how we were reviewing the game as well. But please compare SMU quarterback Kevin Jennings and Trinidad Chambliss. SMU quarterback Kevin Jennings and Trinidad Chambliss, the Ole Miss signal caller who's led the Rebels to this college football playoff semifinal run, they're very similar in a sense as far as how they can extend plays. I would say that Kevin Jennings is maybe a little bit more sudden at times with his movements in the pocket. Trinidad Chambliss is probably built as far as the same size and height, but more of a thicker, not as a wiry framed quarterback. He's a lot more like a Russell Wilson, and I know that's cliche because they wore the same number and things like that. But that is really what Lane Kiffin and his staff compared Trinidad Chambliss to early on in the season when talking with reporters and talking with broadcast crews. And so Russell Wilson, his game, that ability to kind of, I think, throw against his body really well and do it that's accurate. That's something that Trinidad Chambliss has done really well this season. He can roll left. He can roll right. He can throw in different ways. Kevin Jennings kind of has some of those, and I'm not saying Trinidad Chambliss doesn't have wow plays, but some of the plays that Kevin Jennings makes will leave you sitting there saying, holy crap, how did he do that? He's in a very, very tight area, and his arm is, throwing sidearm, kind of throwing like a shortstop in a sense, and he completes the pass. And of course, he's had his moments with turnovers as well. But Trinidad Chambliss is much more of a extend the play, get out of the pocket, and he's hitting an explosive play. He's getting the ball out to his playmakers and things like that, where there's a little bit more almost space with him able to work because he's extended the play at such a high level. So those are two things that jump out to me right off the bat as far as these two quarterbacks and kind of the differences as far as their playmaking ability. I think Trinidad Chambliss this year has been a more capable runner. Kevin Jennings was injured much of the season as far as having a ankle foot kind of deal going on throughout the season that hampered his running ability. But Trinidad Chambliss, they're not afraid to let him run it, and he can do some damage once he's extended the play in that regard too. So those are the two kind of differences right off the bat that jump out to me. But man, this Ole Miss offense is so creative, so many different formations, so many different presentations that they make you prepare for. And I'll be very intrigued to see what that looks like without a long layoff, kind of that like Ole Miss had between Tulane and Georgia. They now have really what is a 8-day, 9-day layoff between these two games. It's going to be interesting to see how many different presentations they can put out there that Miami has to defend against, because also some of the staff has been flying back and forth between Baton Rouge and Oxford. So Trinidad Chambliss has that ability to win and will Ole Miss to this Fiesta Bowl win if he's on, and he's a level of player that he was against Georgia and has been for much of this season. How Miami gets after him and affects him and maybe forces an overthrow that lands in a Miami Hurricane defender's hands. Those are things that I'm watching as far as how they defend Trinidad Chambliss. Let's end the pod with some hoops. But before we do, guys, want to remind you guys, we appreciate all of you guys who have jumped in, been watching. Please do me a favor, and I'll leave this QR code up there on the screen for you guys. But scan that QR code and subscribe to the All Access AM YouTube channel. Please. If there's one thing that you do today to help me out, it is click that QR code and subscribe. If you also want to scroll down, you could hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel, or you can click the link in our podcast episode description and subscribe to the YouTube channel. It helps us grow. It helps us keep this train rolling. And we appreciate all of you guys who have done that for us so far. So thank you to those of you who have done that. ACC Hoops. Tuesday night was a 3-game schedule for the league. Duke at Louisville was the headliner. Duke gets the win 84-73, a dominant second half for the Blue Devils. Really took what was a feel-good story rolling in the right direction at home for the Cardinals and turned it into a nightmare for Pat Kelsey and company. Cam Boozer, 27 points, 10 of 12 from the field. Really impressive night for him as the Blue Devils got hot, and they shot 51% from the field. They only shot 30% from 3-point range, but eventually Louisville cooled off, shooting 40% from the night. Michael Brown is out for Louisville still, so that is something that you have to factor in with this game and the lead that Louisville built. They were able to do it without Michael Brown, leading 47-38 at half. Duke at full strength with Cam Boozer, Isaiah Evans, 23 points, 20 points, Caleb Foster, and a combined, I think, 9 points from the Duke bench in this one. Ali Khalifa, 17 points off the bench for Louisville on the night. Ryan Conwell had another standout game, 24 points for the Cards. But main story here is that Louisville kind of now on the verge of maybe dropping out of the next top 25 with this type of a game. Granted, you lose to Duke, you lose at home, though. It's a disappointing loss for the Cardinals to, yes, exactly, Diego. Jennings on 1 foot as well. But you have Duke that was able to come back in this game and just completely take over the game in the second half. I mean, to hold Louisville to 26 points, really, really tough night for the Cardinals in the second half, as they now sit at 11-4 overall and looking for a big win, in this season for Pat Kelsey. Syracuse did beat Georgia Tech 82-72. NC State beat Boston College on the road 79-71. So those two teams get moving in the right direction. And that sets up a Wednesday slate that has Miami at Wake Forest, 6 p.m. on ESPNU, Stanford all the way at Virginia Tech at 6 p.m. on ACC Network, Cal at number 23 Virginia at 8 p.m. ACC Network, Number 24, SMU taking on Clemson on the road at 8 p.m. on ESPNU. That is a 9 p.m. Eastern time start. That one, kind of a spooky one maybe for SMU, coming off of the high of beating North Carolina. They have the AP National Player of the Week in Boopy Miller taking the floor. Can the Mustangs avoid a letdown before they go and face the Blue Devils in Cameron Indoor for the first time as an ACC team on Saturday? Trap game, good Clemson team, a big opportunity for SMU to kind of keep things rolling, make sure people know that this isn't a kind of a one and done type of win early on in this ACC run for SMU. They need to find a way against 12-3 Clemson tonight to keep things rolling. Clemson, meanwhile, trying to get a really nice win to continue their strong ACC start. They're sitting at they're sitting at 2-0 in league play, wins over Syracuse and Pitt. This is their first test for Clemson of ACC play. So quite the challenge for the Tigers on this Wednesday night. So look, everyone, we hope you guys enjoyed this episode of All Access AM. We will see you guys Thursday morning, bright and early, 7 to 8 a.m. Central, 8 to 9 a.m. Eastern time. It is Portal Bonanza. That's what we'll do. We'll talk a little hoops at the end, but we're going to break down all sorts of things from the transfer portal. So looking forward to doing that on the Thursday show. We appreciate OPW Solutions for sponsoring the show. Of course, that is 214-444-2305. You can reach out to opwsolutions.com for more information on how they can help your business in all of the commercial landscaping, pressure washing, snow and ice control, and more that they do. You can check them out, and you can check out Doyle Glass and his best-selling books honoring veterans fighting for America. And, of course, our friends at the La La Land Foundation. Go to lalalandfoundation.com for ways to get involved with there. So appreciate all of you guys listening. Everyone in the chat this morning, thanks for stopping by. I'm Billy Embody. This has been All Access AM. We will catch you guys Thursday morning. See you then.